Hi, it's Kristen here at UT Southwestern Medical Center. Thank you so much for joining us today for our chat on circadian rhythms. We are thrilled to be joined by Dr. Joe Takahashi. He is chair of the Department of Neuroscience here, as well as an investigator with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which is also affiliated with the Peter O'Donnell Jr. Brain Institute at UT Southwestern. So we are really excited to have you, Dr. Takahashi. I did want to remind people before we get started that don't forget to like and share the conversations as we go along. You know, it's going to be a little bit shorter than our normal ones, but we are going to take as many questions as we can get. And you want to write those questions in the comments field of your Facebook page. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you again for joining us. You know, it should be a really good chat. Just to get us started, you know, if you could tell us, you know, how do you describe circadian rhythms? What's going on there?
Sure. So circadian rhythms are really 24-hour variations in our behavior, physiology, and even in our genes. Mm-hmm. And they're really expressed by almost all living forms on Earth, mm-hmm. from bacteria to humans. Mm-hmm. And they're special because they're an internal clock that organisms have. Mm-hmm. But they're synchronized to the 24-hour cycle of light and dark. Mm-hmm. And they have another special property. They're very resistant to temperature changes. So how fast or slow the clock runs is not influenced so much by temperature.
Interesting.
Temperature compensation. That's a very unusual property.
Wow, that is fascinating. Well, one of the questions we got in that we talked about earlier was, this is from April, and she said, you know, I read that the circadian clock is 25 hours. You know, does this mean that the rhythm is learned, or is it genetic? And so how does that match?
So, yeah, in humans, studies a long time ago suggested that our clocks were very long, say 25, mm-hmm. but more modern studies suggest it's much closer to 24, say 24.3 hours on average.
That's pretty close.
But it's very clear that the clocks are not learned. They're genetically programmed.
Okay.
And we have a special set of genes, mm-hmm. that generate the timing in our cells.
Wow. So her follow-up question was, you know, I don't know how based on fact this is, but would blue light glasses help keep our rhythms in order?
So one of the recent discoveries in the last decade is that there's a special class of photoreceptor in our eyes that no one knew about, a third set that are really involved in synchronizing our clocks, and those receptors are actually blue light sensitive. Okay. So blue light is perhaps the most effective wavelength, mm-hmm. of light for synchronizing our clocks.
Wow, okay. So one of the things, part of the reason we wanted to do this now was because, you know, obviously we just all moved our clocks back for daylight savings time. And I'm wondering, how does that impact our circadian rhythm?
Sure. So actually 25% of the world's population is subject to daylight savings time. So
that sounds terrible.
1.5 billion people on the Earth actually have to shift their clocks back and forth 1 hour in the spring and the fall. Very nice studies by my colleague in Munich, Germany, Till Ronenberg, mm-hmm. Has shown that even though there's just a 1 hour change in time, it's disruptive to us because our bodies are really synchronizing to the day-night cycle, mm-hmm. which does not shift with daylight savings time. Mm-hmm. So you can think of daylight savings time as shifting social time, mm-hmm. or social pressure on us. Right. And so it turns out in the fall, most people can adjust to that 1 hour change relatively easily. But in the spring, it's much more difficult. You have to advance an hour, and depending on your chronotype, that is whether you're a night person or a morning person, mm-hmm. It turns out that for a night person or owl, mm-hmm. It's very difficult to advance even that 1 hour in the spring And some individuals take actually many weeks to resynchronize to that 1 hour change. So it sounds like a small change, but it actually is very disruptive.
So then you mentioned, so that's, with just the time changes, it sounds like then that traveling east, across multiple time zones, say from California to New York, can also be very challenging. Is that the same sort of thing?
That's correct. So on average, most people have more difficulty traveling east, where you have to wake up earlier progressively, as compared to traveling west, where you can wake up later.
Right.
And again, there's a difference between larks and owls.
Yeah.
It's easier for larks to go eastward, wake up earlier, but owls have a lot more difficulty advancing.
Right. So with that, and we're starting to get questions in, that deals a lot with jet lag. People complain a lot because it throws off their sleep cycles, their rhythms. Do you have any tips for how can people address that?
Well, yeah, there's, I guess there are many factors going on. So I think one, it's sort of a complex answer. It depends which direction you're going, east or west, and how far you're going. So say you're going to Europe and you have, say, a 6-hour advance, then you want to actually pay attention to your light exposure so it optimizes your advancing resetting.
Okay.
And so, I don't know how much into the weeds we want to get into this, but...
We can go a little bit into the weeds.
Okay. If you, for example, leave Dallas at night or in the afternoon, you arrive, say, in London at 6 a.m. in the morning, okay? That turns out to be only midnight, your own clock time. If you expose yourself to light at midnight, that will actually delay your clock, not advance it. You're going the wrong direction.
Okay.
But when you arrive in London at 6 a.m., the sun is rising. So if you went outside, you would actually get inappropriate light exposure early in the morning in London. So what you need to do is actually, if you arrive very early, you should stay inside, reduce your light exposure until about lunchtime local time.
Okay.
So then your body will be at a phase where the light will advance you.
Gotcha. Okay.
The other thing is you probably should try to then increase your light exposure the rest of the day there. And that will also enhance your resetting as opposed to delay it.
Okay. So that gets into this other question that we'd had, and that was, you talk about, the light, and can the sleep-wake cycle be influenced by the non-visible spectrum electromagnetic radiation? It's kind of a big question there, but does it play a role at all?
Yeah, I would say that other electromagnetic energy or inputs really are not strong signals to our clock system, because the major signals are actually light in the visible range, where it's more to the blue, as we just discussed, and then not so much in humans or people, but in many other animals, temperature actually also is an important resetting signal. Okay,
so with that in mind, and I just want to take a moment to thank everybody for the questions. Keep them coming. Be sure to write them in the comments field so we see them. But with these temperatures, how does that work? Is it a warmer temperature that affects it, a cooler temperature that affects it?
So again, not for us, but for other animals, usually temperature is high in the daytime and low at night.
Makes sense.
So it's a very predictable cycle that's really driven by the solar cycle.
Gotcha.
So that's the relationship between light and temperature.
So getting back to kind of the circadian rhythms we were discussing earlier, how does your diet play a role in this? How does your diet impact your biological clock?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the discoveries made by the field, again, in the last 20 years or so, is that we have clocks not only in our brain, but in virtually every tissue and cell in our body. And so one of the things that has been really learned more recently is that the organ systems in our body are only weakly controlled by our brain clock, and that other proximal signals, such as nutrient intake, meaning feeding, can be very strong signals, especially to, say, your liver and other digestive organs.
Gotcha.
So if you eat at the wrong time consistently, that will actually shift your liver clock over, even though your brain clock is paying attention to the sun.
Oh, wow. So how do you know what the wrong time is? Have we been able to figure that out?
Well, it turns out that your grandmother was correct, that, keeping a regular schedule and eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner during the appropriate time is really the optimal time for feeding for both animals and humans. And that eating, say, late at night or in the middle of the night is really the wrong time.
Okay. So no late night eating, no eating in the middle of the night. Eat breakfast in the morning, lunch midday, dinner early evening?
That's correct. So, recently work from a number of labs has shown that the time that you eat something may be just as important as what you're eating.
Wow.
So again, this is in the lab. We can feed a mouse a really bad diet, high-fat diet. It will then become obese if you give it to them all the time. But if we only allow that mouse to eat at night, even though it's high-fat diet, it won't gain weight.
Oh, that's fascinating.
But if you feed the same diet in the daytime, which is when the mouse is supposed to be sleeping, because they're opposite to us, then the mouse gains weight and becomes obese.
Wow.
So what that's telling us is that our ability to process nutrients is completely different in the daytime and the nighttime.
So what are some other factors that people might not consider that impact circadian rhythm? I mean, we've got diet, we talked about that. Are there other things that people should be aware of?
Well, again, sleep is a very important component. So the clock, of course, is involved in regulating the timing of our sleep. But sleep has an independent set of processes.
Right.
So we really think about the control of sleep as a two-process system. Part of the timing comes from the clock system, but there's a separate sleep system that acts, we call the homeostat. It's a self-correcting system. So the longer you've been awake, then some process is accumulating that really is driving you towards sleep. And as we're awake longer and longer, that process takes over and we must go to sleep. And so there's a balance between how long we've been awake, then that triggers this response to go to sleep, and we have to kind of restore our sleep reserves.
Gotcha. So what about those, what about people who work nights? I mean, or who work, swing shifts? Is it unhealthy for people to work overnight and sleep during the day? Does that mess up your circadian rhythm?
Yeah, so there's actually quite a large literature now showing that shift work actually has a number of negative consequences, and in fact is considered a risk factor for cancer, certain forms of cancer.
Heard that.
In a number of very reputable large-scale epidemiological studies.
Something to think about.
That's correct.
All right, so we've got another couple questions coming in here that we're going to take. One of these, can a time change trigger depression? It's kind of a big question there. Have you seen any research on that, findings?
Yeah, there's been a lot of interest in the relationship between clocks and depression and other, disorders of that kind, I think it's not clear that, you know, you can say a time change is a trigger for everyone, but it wouldn't surprise me if it wasn't a trigger for some individuals, because just as we spoke before, that 1 hour shift is actually a stress that our biological clock system can feel, and it takes a long time for some individuals to reset. So I think that it could be another source of stress, and we certainly know that stress can trigger depression.
Absolutely. So that was another question. A follow-up question was, you know, I think you've answered this before. I feel like I've seen people have asked, you know, do time changes and changes in circadian rhythms lead to more heart attacks? That seems like it could for specific people, maybe not generally.
Yeah, again, we know just from historical studies that the incidence of heart attack is highest in the morning when we first wake up. That's very clear.
Because nobody wants to get up.
We don't actually understand the reason for that.
Okay.
But I think what hasn't been clearly established is that a time change to, say, daylight savings is going to make that worse. I don't think we know that.
Okay. So let's get back a little bit. So you were talking earlier on when we first started the chat, we were talking about circadian rhythms and how daylight saving time and spring forward and backward and the constant clock changes, how they affect us. I mean, are there ways that things people can do to not be so affected by those changes? Because I don't see the clock moving forward and backward changing anytime soon.
Well, I think, you know, if we step back, it's a more general problem having to do with modern society. So we as humans control our own environment. So we have artificial lighting.
Oh, yeah.
And so one of the things that we do now in modern society is we extend the daytime into the night with artificial lighting. And so that's introduced a number of changes in how we synchronize to the 24-hour cycle.
Gotcha.
So, you know, if we look at more primitive societies that may not have, say, electrical lighting, it's clear that their synchronization is very different to ours in the modern world. And so our society has introduced this. Now, on top of that, we have all these other changes. So we have shift work on top of that. And there are just many other interruptions that can occur at night in modern society now. So we have electronic devices, 24/7 entertainment.
Yeah.
And so in a way, it's much more difficult because of our society to have a regular schedule. And so to sort of answer your question, I think one way is to try to filter out or partition your schedule to try to be more regular and not to be interrupted during our sleep time.
Okay, so I think that's a really great goal. I hope to achieve that someday. That is, though, very tied to this question from Alex that we discussed. He said, you know, are there any good mobile tools, apps, or devices that can improve your sleep, your circadian rhythm? I mean, does that exist, or is it really up to each individual person?
Yeah, so there are actually at least a couple apps on the phone that have been developed by my colleagues to help you understand your circadian rhythm. One of them is called Entrain by Danny Forger at the University of Michigan. That allows you to try to adapt to jet lag. And we'll actually develop a schedule for you and give you some advice on how to best reset your clock. So tell you when to sleep, when you should be indoors, that sort of thing? That's correct. It's, you know, I would say it's still a little bit complicated to use because there's so many factors.
I would think so.
The other feature, which is really generally available, is there are just many wearables that measure your activity.
Right, okay.
And so a lot of them give you feedback on your sleep efficiency. I think it's still a question about how effective those devices are in actually measuring your sleep.
Gotcha.
But what's good about them is that because you use your phone all the time, and many people have wearable devices, that we can monitor our own activity program, and sort of look at whether we have a regular sleep pattern or not. And part of that is going to, if you pay attention to it, you can improve your sleep.
That's the key point, and that's going to get to this. I know we're getting close to end of time. We got a couple more questions, including one of them from Risha, and I apologize if I mispronounced your name, but she's saying, can increased use of your mobile phone alter your circadian rhythms? If you're on the phone late at night, look with the light, does that play a role?
Yes, so that's a very good question. So there's a very interesting study by one of my former graduate students. Her name's Anne-Marie Chang, who's now at Penn State University. And what she found is she studied individuals who read in the evening with either an iPad,
the tablets,
or a book. And she clearly showed that just the exposure from iPad at night was sufficient to delay your clock.
Oh, wow.
At least an hour, and delay the onset of your sleep. And again, this gets back to this blue light question. So even though blue light is good for your synchronization in the daytime, at nighttime you actually want to reduce your blue light exposure. So for example, many devices now have settings on your phone that shift the wavelength spectrum of your screen from more blue to reddish wavelengths.
Oh, wow. I have
so one of those is called night shift. There are other ones that are like that. And so you can set your phone so it's more red at night, and that's something that you really should do. That's, again, getting back to society and the effects of artificial light
and all the technology.
That's right.
Good, very good question. Thanks for asking. So we're going to take one, maybe two more questions. This one comes from Kim, and she says, how do you, and I'm not sure if you can address this, but it says, how do you help a young adult that's post-meningitis who has DSPS disorder and REM disorder? Is that possible? Is that something we can address, or should you contact a physician?
Yeah, I would say that REM disorder is something that a sleep physician or neurologist really should be monitoring and treating.
Right.
DSPS, which is delayed sleep phase syndrome, is a much more common trait among most of us. And so again, there the problem is not staying up too late, because it's very hard to wake up earlier once you stay up late, especially if you're, so a DSPS person is like an extreme owl, if you want to think about it that way.
Yeah.
And owls have trouble advancing, waking up early, and so if you get into this late waking up kind of pattern, one of the ways that you can fix it is to actually keep staying up late and go all the way around the world, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
Until you're waking up at the right time. That's sort of
it's a little extreme.
That's an extreme intervention, but it's actually something that is used on extreme owls.
Awesome. All right. Well, that is the last question I'm going to ask is what is the difference between somebody who's an owl and somebody who's a lark, and are there people in between?
Sure. The majority of people are in between. The owls and the larks are the extremes. So larks are individuals who wake up early, tend to go to sleep early, and owls are the opposite. they stay up late and they wake up late. Now we know that there are many genetic factors that contribute to that preference. So we think that this is largely innate or genetically determined, your disposition to be an early person or a late person.
And which one is easy? Which one handles the time changes and better?
Right, so larks are actually more rare than owls, and larks can go east and wake up earlier more easily than owls can.
Okay, good questions. Well, thank you very much for your time. We're going to wrap it up today. Thank you, everybody, for all the great questions. This will be available here on our Facebook page later, as well as on our YouTube channel. So we encourage you to go and share and leave more comments, leave additional questions for Dr. Takahashi if you have them. In the meantime, thank you for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you.